Grab a sandwich and go. Quick and easy food for most of us is part of our lives. But a bacterial outbreak here in the UK is raising questions over the real cost of convenience. Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the latest outbreak of foodborne illness in the UK has once again shone a spotlight on commercial preparation. So, is this a failure of safety standards, the supply chain, or all of the above?
These supermarket chains all had to recall dozens of sandwiches, wraps and salads. People were getting sick, dozens ended up in hospital, one has died. The culprit? A toxic strain of E. coli bacteria in the lettuce. E. coli is a bacterium that normally lives in the guts of humans and animals, but certain strains, often found in raw vegetables and undercooked meat, can cause moderate to severe illness. In extreme cases, this can lead to kidney failure. The UK's Food Standards Agency said contaminated lettuce in the supply chain caused the outbreak. For something like a sandwich to make it to supermarket shelves, the ingredients are grown on a farm, then transported for assembly, packing and distribution. They're then transported again to their final destination before ending up on your plate. This is a more complicated process than simply putting some meat, cheese and lettuce between bread. Food recalls aren't just happening in the UK. In the US, the Food and Drug Administration recalled 140 canned coffee brands due to potential contamination by a fatal neurotoxin, as well as 13 ice cream brands over listeria fears. While the vast majority of food is safe, what more can and should be done to ensure that no one else ends up sick?
Well, let's meet our guests. In Cheshire in the UK is Paul Hunter. He's a professor in medicine at the University of East Anglia. In Brighton is Sarah Pitt. She's a microbiologist at the University of Brighton and a fellow of the Institute of Biomedical Science. And joining us from London is Dr. Khaled Sadek. He is general practitioner and founder of the Arista Medical Clinic. Dr. Khaled, I'll come to you first. How worried should we be about this?
Hi, thanks, Edna. Well, look, I think if you go into your supermarket for your lunch break and you buy yourself a meal deal, the last thing you want to be worrying about is being hospitalized with severe gastroenteritis. So with that in mind, the numbers are small, but the symptoms are severe. So I think the Public Health England's notice on pulling certain products from supermarket shelves is a good move. And the general public should be comfortable in the knowledge that those products have been removed from the market, but should still be cautious when handling these kind of food produce.
Sarah, tell me, we know E. coli, we know the name, we don't know very much about it, we know it's bad, it pops up in the media, it always makes headlines when there's an outbreak. Just talk to us about what it actually is and what it does to the human body.
So it's a bacteria, and it's kind of found in soil and in the environment, and a lot of people carry some strains of E. coli naturally in their feces, as do animals. And so it's kind of around and about us all the time. But in this case, what we're looking at is a particular strain of E. coli that produces a toxin. So that's quite unusual, and that is then much nastier than the normal E. coli that we've been talking about, for example, in relation to sewage works and sewage discharge in the rivers. This is different, and in most people it can give you a very severe diarrhea, stomach cramps, and just generally bad gastroenteritis. But obviously, in some people, is much more serious illness. We are seeing some people who are getting into hospital, and in young children it can be very serious as well. But that's actually not that common. Most people will just have a very nasty gastroenteritis infection.
So Paul, occasionally people eat something and it gives them an upset stomach. What do you think we should be looking out for? Sarah mentioned some of the symptoms there. What should we be looking out for in terms of E. coli and, if this is getting more serious?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things about this type of E. coli infection is that about 80% of people get bloody diarrhea, so they see blood in the stool. And that is a warning sign. There are other causes of blood in the stool, but by and large, when you see blood in the stool with diarrhea, you need to contact the NHS 111 or your GP. As you said, it is the big concern with E. coli STEX it's of all the diseases that are common in the UK, the gastroenteritis diseases that are common, this is the one that generally has the highest fatality rate. Particularly in older people, but also we see something called hemolytic uremic syndrome in children, in very young children, and that's a leading cause of renal failure in children, and can also at times be responsible for the death of the child. So it is a very serious infection compared to most other causes of diarrhea that we generally see in this country.
Thanks, Paul. Let's take a look at the numbers. How many people are actually affected by contaminated food? Globally, it is an estimated 600 million. That's almost 1 in 10 people fall ill after eating contaminated food each year, resulting in a staggering 420,000 deaths. In Europe, an estimated 5,000 people die per year due to a foodborne illness. In the UK, there are an estimated 2.4 million cases of foodborne illness each year, and it's costing the UK economy around $11 billion annually. Khaled, given the volume of food produced and consumed, I guess it's a miracle that these figures aren't probably higher.
Well, yes, you'd think so. The good news is that the large proportion of the food supply is safe for consumption. What we are noticing is that there are sporadic episodes where we are picking up these specific E. coli infections, and we're really good at kind of detecting where they are and be able to sort of localize the source. So if you're suffering any symptoms, like they've mentioned, diarrhea, abdo pain, cramping, dehydration, fatigue, following maybe the consumption of a food, then you should definitely contact your GP. They can get the process of notifying Public Health England so that we can identify where the clusters are and try and work out the source quite quickly.
And Dr. Khaled, when people turn up at your practice or elsewhere looking for medical treatment, in milder cases, is it easily treated with antibiotics or conventional medicine?
Yeah, with the large majority of gastroenteritis is self-limiting, whether that's viral or through bacteria or toxins in general. Where the real problem comes is when we have very young or very elderly vulnerable individuals who are then subjected to Shiga toxins or STEC infections, and what happens there is the dehydration is so severe that their body is unable to mount a defense to counter this. And like Prof. Hunter's mentioned, you get this hemolytic uremic syndrome where your blood is breaking down, your kidneys are failing, and you're unable to mount a clotting defense. So in the most severe vulnerable cases, it can be critical and require hospital admission. But in the vast majority of healthy young individuals, it's self-limiting.
Sarah, just tell us who's to blame here when E. coli ends up in a sandwich or a wrap and people are in a rush and they eat it. And then the next thing, as we're discovering, it's causing very, very serious bowel problems.
So the reason that E. coli gets into your lunch will be a combination of two things. It will be that the soil contamination has got onto, in this case, we're looking at lettuce leaves, salad leaves, would have got onto the lettuce leaves during cultivation, and then it hasn't been washed properly in the processing plant, or there may have been some contamination within the processing plant at some stage. I'm not sure we actually know the full picture about what's happening with this outbreak even now. So, and there'll be processes and procedures and health and safety and food safety measures in place. So there's not really anyone to blame, but we do need to find out the exact source of it so that we can shut that down and potentially go and do deep cleaning and try and make sure that that particular source of this type of E. coli is not infecting any more food, and potentially allowing the other food processing plants who the sandwiches have been withdrawn from a lot of manufacturers as a precaution, but most of those are probably not involved. They're probably fine. So it will allow those people to get back to selling sandwiches and allow us to eat takeaway lunches a bit more safely.
Paul, it always hits the news, doesn't it, when the big name supermarkets withdraw a product, and the tabloids and the news websites love it because these are names that we all shop at. How much responsibility do the supermarkets have to make it clear to their suppliers that, you know, they need to be taking more precautions?
Yeah, I mean, clearly everybody in the food chain has a legal responsibility for delivering food that is not going to harm people. I think the problem with STEC infections generally, and a few years ago we reviewed all the outbreaks that had happened associated with salad leaves globally, and it's often very difficult to find out where in the food chain this organism got in. Almost certainly most of the contamination is actually at the farm level where the lettuces are grown. Where we know the reason for that, it's usually because of contaminated water, but either directly onto the lettuce leaves or spraying on the ground and then splashing soil onto the lettuce leaves. Washing does remove E. coli, but not 100% effectively. So it is really difficult to know how you can actually make salads totally safe in this regard.
Paul, what would you say to people who take the view that it's good for you, unwashed lettuce leaves, or, you know, a little bit of exposure to some salt? You know, you've heard this argument before. What would you say to these people who think, oh, you can eat that without washing it, it'll be fine?
No, I think green salads need to be washed. While I still worked full-time in the health service before I became a university professor, one of the last patients that I dealt with actually died from a salmonella infection that was caught from lettuce. So yeah, lettuce needs to be cooked, needs to be washed. Any suggestion that eating raw lettuce is good for you is misguided in the extreme.
Dr. Khaled, I'll just get your take on that as well. Would you were in agreement?
Well, look. Certainly, it's common sense. You know, wash your food before you eat it. You don't know what touch points have happened from where it's been pulled out to the ground and landed on your plate. So it's sensible to wash your food, cook your food properly. Beware of unpasteurized milk and unpasteurized cheeses as well. So certainly there are some simple steps that individuals can take in terms of food preparation and hygiene to mitigate the risk of getting a gastroenteritis.
Sarah, how difficult then is it you were talking earlier on about tracing it back. How difficult is it for the food companies to work out where that batch of lettuce has come from?
Yes, it's very difficult, because what happens is the majority of people who get ill from contaminated lettuce probably won't seek medical attention. They might say, oh, I've got a bit of food poisoning, and normal healthy adults will probably be ill for a couple of days, and then they will get better and they will think nothing of it. So the only people who will actually get tested for, in this case, E. coli, will be people who are seriously ill enough to get into hospital. And that might be a week or longer after they've actually ate the infected produce. And then my colleagues in the laboratory will do a test to say what's the cause of it, what's the bacteria, oh, it's E. coli. They then do another test to say, oh, this is this particular strain. It's 045 in this case, but whichever the strain of the E. coli we're talking about here. And then those samples will be sent off to a specialist reference laboratory for further testing to say it's this particular strain that's associated with this outbreak. That's one of the reasons why new cases are being included in this outbreak at the moment, even the last week. But they're not necessarily people who got sick last week, but they're people who've had the full suite of tests that includes them now in this outbreak. You're then asking people to say, what do you think you might have eaten maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago? And then if they've all got in common something which was a sandwich that had lettuce in, you've then got to go back to the salad providers and say, and to do testing in their processing plants. But they may well have cleaned everything, changed everything. That actual batch of lettuce probably still isn't there. And so that's why it's so difficult to actually pinpoint what's really happening. And sometimes they never get to the bottom of where it really came from.
And Paul, just talk to me about consumer responsibility here. I mean, we're all in such a rush in our lunch breaks. You know, people are just kind of whizzing around, and sometimes people don't have time to wash stuff thoroughly. But everything you've been telling us is that, you know, we need to take this more seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the outbreaks that we're aware of globally with salads or sprouting beans, they were sort of marketed on a commercial basis. So, you know, bags of lettuce, we've had in the past outbreaks associated with bags of lettuce, outbreaks associated with lettuce in sandwich or salad, leafy salad, actually, not just lettuce, in sandwiches. And so it's at the commercial level. Just before COVID, we did a large study of people with who'd got STEC without being associated with an outbreak, and it does appear that eating green salads does cause illness even in the general public, not associated with outbreaks, and it's actually very difficult in these sort of sporadic cases to identify the fact that you have an outbreak. I'd say the other issue here is that if it was a meat-based outbreak, and we've seen outbreaks of E. coli associated with meats, particularly undercooked burgers in the past, we generally know where that meat comes from. There are records on how the animals are moved both before and after slaughtering that you can go back and look at. With salad crops, it's much more difficult unless the supplier actually has a contract with a particular farm. A lot of the salad sold in this country come from all over the place, are sold in big markets, often in the Netherlands, and trying to track back to where on the farm that had become contaminated is often impossible. This time of year, I'm hopeful that they would be able to identify ultimately the farms, because this time of year most salads that we eat are grown in the UK, but much of the time you can never identify where these lettuces have become contaminated, and almost always you never get STEC cultured from the salads, which makes life even more difficult.
Dr. Khaled, is this current outbreak in the UK under control, or is there a worry that the strain is dormant and it may flare up again in a few weeks' time?
Well, I mean, it's unlikely to sort of have that sort of behavior. The incubation period is typically 3 to 5 days. So if we are saying that there's a batch of lettuce that's in the food chain, eventually that batch will get processed, and then it will kind of pass through, and those individuals will have about a week after consumption to have their sort of symptoms develop. So I'd say we'd probably seen the peak of it, and it's now sort of petering off. But obviously keeping a track on numbers to make sure there isn't like a continuous stream of contaminated products entering the food chain would tell us whether or not it's going to drag out further.
So Sarah, what kind of challenges are there for the authorities in terms of stopping an outbreak dead in its tracks?
Well, it's very difficult, because what you need to do is find the people who have been affected, and then try and find out what they all have in common, and then try and shut down the source. And what we've seen with this outbreak here in the UK, it was that a couple of weeks ago, it was started being reported in the news, and it said there is an outbreak associated with a very common foodstuff. And all they knew that all over the country, there were people who were going into hospital with E. coli, with this particular toxin, the S-tech toxin, and this particular strain of the S-tech toxin. But they were all over the country, so they suspected that they'd been infected by something that was commonly available in, as we've seen, supermarkets and chains of sandwich shops, but they didn't know what it was. And so the problem is with any kind of outbreak like that, if you don't know exactly what's causing it within a few days, it spreads very easily, and then it's difficult to actually shut down the source of the original source of the infection before it's spread too wide. And so with something like this, it's just something that we see quite commonly, that it does spread, just because of it's not as because it's all the things we've talked about, how it's quite difficult to detect in the first place, and it's quite difficult to connect all the people who are involved in the outbreak in a timely manner to try and stop any more people get infected. What we seem to have to wait is for the outbreak to kind of run through, and then try and learn the lesson from what happened this time and try and put measures in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's the best thing we can do, really, is stop future outbreaks rather than trying to prevent this one in the first place.
Paul, we know the supermarkets put huge pressure on suppliers. They're squeezing every last penny out of people. Do you think that's perhaps a bit of an issue in the UK, that the supermarkets put pressure on people to, more, quicker, faster, and that the problem then comes into the supply chain?
I think we do have to make sure that to balance cheap food with ensuring that everybody in the food chain has the incentive to deliver food that's safe and has the resources to do that. And certainly if you reduce income too far up the food chain, for people, they have less money to invest in ways of maintaining safe food. So I think we've got to be careful that although as a society we're used to cheap food and we will continue to benefit from cheap food, we don't do that at the expense of ensuring that the food in the food chain is safe.
Khaled, would you go along with that?
Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it, that if you are struggling to sort of make your margins, then you may be sort of more encouraged to cut corners. And health and safety and hygiene are one of the first ones to kind of take a hit on that front.
Sarah, just talk to us, if you can, about other countries. I mean, is the UK alone in these outbreaks, or do other countries like France and Germany and Italy, do they see flare-ups every now and then?
Yes, we see outbreaks of E. coli associated with toxin and other sorts of food poisoning all over the world, really. We're not particularly an outlier for Europe, but it is something that is seen in countries all across the world. It's not something that's particularly dependent on climate or some of the other, some other diseases are more prevalent in some parts of the world than other, but this is just commonly found everywhere because it is in the soil and because it is transmitted through contaminated food and water. Everybody in the world is potentially subjected to that kind of risk.
Paul, we're constantly taught about the importance of having a healthy, balanced diet, fruit, vegetables, but just give us your kind of public messaging on the importance of washing those items before we consume them, because we're getting rid of the danger, aren't we?
Yeah, I would say that even washing lettuce, if the lettuce is contaminated, it's very difficult to wash S-tech off lettuce leaves once they've become contaminated. You can do that to a certain extent, but actually eliminating it by washing is very difficult, even if you add chlorine to the wash water, as some people do, as some commercial units do. So at the moment, there will always be a slight risk. This is an organism, although we talked about it in soil, it's actually an organism that's primarily in cattle. And it's within cattle that the S-techs have been spreading. And cattle contaminate the soil, and often some of the outbreaks you get after heavy rain, which could have been responsible here actually, washes contaminated water into the areas where lettuce is grown. So it is something that I don't think we can ever eradicate this risk. The largest outbreak that I'm aware of was in Germany about 7 years ago, and that led to the death of about 50 people, mainly young women, and that was associated with sprouting beans. So I don't eat sprouting beans since then. And it's the issue of doing what you can to make sure that where you do have the ability to do that, you wash it. Clearly, when you're buying sandwiches, you're reliant on other people doing that effectively, and by and large, they do.
Sarah, Paul, and Dr. Khaled, thank you all so much for your insight on that. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.